In 2009, during the quiet hours of Easter morning, two devoted nuns disappeared from a rural convent outside Charleston, South Carolina, vanished without a trace. The case baffled local authorities and was quietly buried under layers of rumor and resignation. But 14 years later, a lost little girl stumbles upon a hidden tunnel beneath the abandoned chapel grounds, and with it, a secret that was never meant to be uncovered. Easter morning in Riverview, Missouri had always held a quiet reverence. A small, sleepy town, nestled between the gentle curves of the Missouri River, Riverview boasted one church, a single bakery, and more old stories than it had streetlights. But in 2009, Easter Sunday would become the day that ripped that tranquility apart. The bell of St. Madeline's Chapel rang solemnly at 5:45 IME, calling the faithful to sunrise Mass. It was a tradition dating back almost a century, a gathering that brought the town together in reflection and hope. That morning, the usual preparations had been underway since dawn. Sister Mary Eloise and Sister Judith Keller, both residents of the adjoining convent, were assigned to prepare the altar and floral arrangements. The two women, known for their kindness and meticulous dedication, were last seen arranging lilies by the chapel's eastern transept. A few parishioners reported brief sightings around 6:30 a.m., both nuns smiling gently, clad in pale blue habits with a woven basket of communion linens between them. By 7:15, they were gone. At first, no one panicked. Maybe they had gone back to the convent for more supplies. Maybe they had been called away by Mother Agnes. But when the o'clock Mass began and their seats in the choir remained empty, questions began to rise. By 9:30, a quiet buzz of concern had spread through the congregation. At noon, when no one had heard from either sister and their cell phones remained unanswered, Father Donald Fay made the call to local authorities. Sheriff Walter Griggs was no stranger to missing persons reports, usually rebellious teenagers or confused elderly folks. But two nuns disappearing on Easter morning from church grounds? It made no sense. His deputies swept the chapel, the convent, the surrounding wooded lot behind the property. Dogs were brought in by sundown. Nothing, not a footprint out of place, not a shred of torn cloth or sign of struggle. Their rooms were untouched, beds neatly made, shoes aligned by the door. No personal effects were missing. Their purses, IDs, and even a half-finished crossword puzzle sat undisturbed on the convent kitchen table. The media quickly latched onto the story. Scattering spiritual creatures, speculation spiraled. Some whispered of cult activity, others claimed the sisters had eloped, abandoning their vows. But those who truly knew Sister Mary and Sister Judith refused to believe such theories. "They would never just leave," said Mother Agnes in a trembling interview, clasping a rosary tight in her wrinkled fingers. "They were devoted to God, to this community, to each other." Then, a few weeks later, the first oddity emerged. A little girl named Emily Nolan, 7 years old and bright as a button, handed her Sunday school teacher a crumpled sheet of paper. On it, she'd drawn a crude illustration. Two women standing in front of what looked like a church basement door, and behind them, a long, thin black shape reaching up from the floor. The caption she'd scribbled in shaky lettering read, "The Thing from the Dark Room." Her teacher, Mrs. Carla Sandstrom, chalked it up to too many ghost stories. But Emily's parents weren't so dismissive. "She's been waking up screaming every night," her mother confessed. "She keeps saying, 'The sisters are in the floor. They're under the church.'" When the drawing made its way to Sheriff Griggs' desk, he sighed. Emily had a documented language processing disorder. She sometimes confused imagination with memory. Still, the timing was eerie. The sheriff had a crew inspect the chapel basement, which was really nothing more than an old wine cellar and furnace crawl space. It had been sealed for years and used only for storage. The inspection yielded dust, cobwebs, and silence. And yet something about the child's drawing lingered in Griggs's mind. The black shape, the way the door in her picture bore a tiny cross carved above the knob, an exact match to the old maintenance room door beneath the chapel. A detail Emily should have never known. The investigation dragged on for months. Search teams came and went. Psychics were consulted. Tips dried up. The chapel was reopened, but attendance waned. No one liked being in a building where two women of God had evaporated into air. 14 years passed, the story faded from national memory, but clung to Riverview like the persistent fog that curled along the river each morning. The Nolan family moved away after Emily's condition worsened, and the convent eventually shut down. St. Madeline's became a historical relic, locked, unused, but not forgotten. In time, the church grounds grew quiet again, but in that silence, in the walls and under the stone floor, something waited. The clouds over Riverview had begun gathering by early afternoon, dense and dark, rolling low across the sky like a tidal wave of ash. 14 years had passed since the disappearance of Sister Mary Eloise and Sister Judith Keller, yet the memory lingered in the air of the town, quiet and watchful like a ghost no one dared to speak of. Most people simply pretended the chapel didn't exist anymore. The gates were locked, the windows boarded, even the city council had stopped talking about converting it into a museum. It was a structure kept standing more out of hesitation than intention, like the town itself wasn't sure whether it belonged to God or to something else. On that cloudy Saturday, the Historical Society hosted a local tour, taking visitors to long-forgotten sites around the town: old mills, Civil War bunkers, abandoned railroad tracks swallowed by weeds. Among the stops was St. Madeline's Chapel. The tour guide, a wiry man named Craig, avoided going into detail about the incident, instead referring to it vaguely as an unresolved safety matter. He warned visitors not to get too close, citing structural damage and potential wildlife nests. Lila Bennett, 9 years old and impossibly curious, was more interested in the ivy-covered structure than any of the dry facts Craig rattled off. Her mother, Dana, was chatting with another parent near the tour bus, her back briefly turned. That was all it took. Lila wandered from the gravel path toward the east side of the chapel, where thick vines wrapped around a crumbling stone wall, like fingers refusing to let go. The air felt cooler there, damp and faintly metallic, like old coins soaked in rain. A drizzle began to fall as thunder mumbled in the distance. Lila tilted her face up to the gray sky, blinking away droplets. She should have gone back, she knew that, but there was something about the way the trees swayed near the chapel's edge that made her feet move forward. A rusted fence section had toppled long ago, allowing her small frame to squeeze through. The moment she crossed the invisible line between maintained park grounds and forbidden history, the sounds of the group seemed to vanish. It was just her and the building now, and the storm. The rain came harder, cold and stinging. She looked for a place to shelter and spotted a tree with a thick canopy nearby. As she ran, her foot slipped on wet moss. She yelped and tumbled sideways into a thicket, arms out to break her fall. But the earth beneath her wasn't solid. With a sharp gasp, Lila dropped through what felt like a collapsing patch of ground, disappearing into shadow. She landed hard on her side, a shallow splash echoing in the hollow space around her. She coughed, dazed, and sat up slowly. The ceiling above her was not sky, it was rock and root and fractured concrete. Water trickled down the walls in thin streams. Her ankle throbbed, but she could move it. Around her, the air was thick with the scent of mildew, like old basements and forgotten places. She pulled her small flash from her raincoat pocket, flicked it on, and gasped. The beam revealed stone walls covered in writing, some etched, some scratched, some painted hastily with fingers dipped in what looked like rust. By Latin phrases, crosses, scripture, and dozens of tally marks carved into the mortar. Lila stumbled to her feet, shining the light along the narrow corridor. Ahead was a rusted iron gate, barely ajar. Beyond it, stairs curved downward, vanishing into blackness. Behind her, the collapsed earth offered no way back up, at least not without help. "Mom," she called out, her voice shaking, swallowed by the underground. No response. She took a shaky breath. She was brave. Dad always said so. He'd be like, "You're a brave little engine," he'd tell her every time she had to do something hard. And so she took a step forward, then another, the beam of her flashlight slicing through the dark like a lighthouse searching for land. The stairwell groaned under her weight, ancient and damp, as if it resented her intrusion. At the bottom, the passage widened slightly into a room, stone walls, a wooden bench collapsed on one side, and something that looked like an altar cracked in half, with candle stubs melted onto its surface. She wasn't in a basement. She was in a sanctuary, underground. The walls breathed history and something else, something that watched. On the far side of the room was another door, not wood but metal, marked with a single black cross. It bore no handle, just 4 long scratches near its base, like someone or something had once tried desperately to claw their way out. Leila stared, transfixed. Then, behind her, water trickled again, louder this time. She turned just as a cascade of rainwater surged into the tunnel through the hole she had fallen from. The current knocked her to her knees and sent her flashlight clattering across the stone. It rolled to a stop at the base of the claw-marked door. For a moment, as lightning flashed through the breach above, she thought she saw movement beyond that metal door, something long, slow, and deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat. And then, just as quickly, the darkness returned. She crawled toward the flashlight, her hands scraping over rough stone. As she reached for it, the air shifted again. This time, it wasn't water or wind. It was a sound, soft, rhythmic, almost like someone humming beneath their breath. Faint, just beyond the door. She froze, listening. Then the humming stopped. Her fingers closed around the flashlight, her heart pounding. But before she could stand, the metal door trembled. Not much, just enough for the scratches to flake tiny bits of rust into the water pooling at her feet. Leila didn't scream. She held her breath, every instinct in her body telling her to stay quiet, to listen, to wait. And then she heard it again, this time clearer, a woman's voice, whispering her name. Leila's breath came shallow, sharp against the dampness, her tiny hands gripping the flashlight like a talisman. The whisper had dissolved as quickly as it had come, leaving her in a silence so complete it roared in her ears. Her name didn't echo, it just vanished into the walls, as though swallowed. She rose slowly, her knees trembling from cold and fear, and stepped back from the rusted door with the claw mark. Her flashlight flickered once, threatening to betray her, but held steady. She knew she had to move, to find a way out, to find someone or at the very least understand where she was. She turned and followed the tunnel to the left, her footsteps muffled by the soaked earth beneath her sneakers. The passage gradually widened, revealing a narrow corridor branching off at an angle, lined with stone slabs that bore strange indentations like old storage cubbies carved into the rock. The air grew colder, but the smell changed too, less mildew, more metallic, like old iron and something decayed. As she reached the next chamber, her light caught on a curved wall that had collapsed partially inward, revealing a cracked metal pipe, and the edge of what looked like a rusted shelf embedded into the stone. Cans. Dozens of them. Most were swollen, labels faded into illegibility, but some still bore names she recognized. Beans, peaches, sardines. Everything was decades old, maybe more. A few cans had burst, sludge inside hardened into gray-green paste. Nearby, a crate had broken open, revealing cloth bundles, blankets, now stiff and discolored, and what appeared to be a moth-eaten military jacket with a faded Union insignia. She wasn't just in a tunnel, she was in a Civil War air bunker. A hidden system, likely forgotten by everyone above. The presence of rations, supplies, even a tiny wood stove set into the wall with a rusted stovepipe extending into the ceiling, told her this place had been meant for living, for hiding, maybe even surviving something. She shivered. What had they been hiding from? She walked slowly along the curved chamber, flashlight grazing the walls. Then she saw it. Etched into the stone in careful, deliberate lines were scriptures. Not just random verses, but full psalms, written in Latin and English both, layered over each other like someone had tried to cover old thoughts with new prayers. Dominine, exaudi orationem meam, she read aloud softly. Lord, hear my prayer. The walls bore prayers of desperation, pleas for forgiveness, protection, and strength. Names were scratched beneath verses, Sister Eloise, Sister Judith. Another simply read, Leila froze. These were the names of the women who had disappeared. Her heart thudded in her chest as she turned to her right, drawn by a small alcove just beyond the far side of the room. The space was no bigger than a closet, walled in by crumpling brick. Inside, something pale and soft lay, crumpled near a cracked wooden bench. As she stepped closer, the flashlight beam revealed it. A veil. A nun's veil, blue-gray in color, with a tiny embroidered cross on the hem. It was dirty, spotted with mildew, but unmistakable. Next to it, in the thick coat of dust on the bench, was a handprint. Small, delicate. The fingers were thin, and the pattern looked fresh enough that Lila could still see the slight imprint of fingernail grooves. Her mouth went dry. No bones, no signs of struggle, just the veil and the handprint. It was like someone had been sitting here very recently. She backed out of the alcove, suddenly aware of how loud her breathing had become. The air pressed tighter around her now, the sense of being watched creeping up her spine with every step. She turned back toward the main tunnel, planning to retrace her path, but paused as she passed another door, wooden this time, but reinforced with iron bands. It stood ajar. She pushed it with her fingertips, and it creaked inward, revealing another chamber, this one larger, more refined. The floor had once been tiled, though most of the pieces were now cracked or missing. In the center stood a raised stone platform, an altar. Candle stubs melted into strange shapes were scattered across it. A brass crucifix leaned sideways against the back wall, its surface tarnished black. More writing lined the walls, this time carved deeper, angrier. "Deliver us from the flesh. She would not be quiet. He watches through the stone." At the far end of the chamber was a cot, barely intact. The blanket covering it looked recently disturbed. Lila approached and froze as she noticed something pinned beneath one corner of the mattress. A photograph. She pulled it out slowly, brushing dust from the curled edges. The image was old, worn, but clear. Two women in habits sat on a bench outside a church, smiling gently at the camera. One was older, the other younger, with a face strikingly similar to a newspaper clipping Lila's mom had once shown her. Sister Mary Eloise, and next to her, Lila didn't know her name, but she recognized her from the caption beneath the photo. Taken April 2009, St. Madeline's Chapel. A chill ran down her arms. She turned to leave, intending to take the photo with her, but then she heard it again. The humming. This time, closer. Behind her. Lila burst from the bushes near the chapel grounds just as the rain began to ease into a fine mist, her coat streaked with mud and her hair plastered to her cheeks. She didn't stop running until she spotted the tour group in the distance, a frantic blur of umbrellas and half-packed vans. Her voice cracked as she called for her mother. Dana Bennett turned, alarm flashing in her eyes, and sprinted to her daughter, arms outstretched. "Lila, where have you been? You're soaked. What happened?" But Lila didn't answer right away. She was out of breath, her face pale, her hands clutching a dirty piece of cloth and a crumpled photo. "Mom," she gasped, "I found something. Underground, a tunnel. There's a door, a voice—" Her words tumbled out in a rush, disjointed, barely coherent. Dana knelt beside her, brushing wet strands of hair away and trying to calm her enough to make sense. When Lila finally explained, her mother's brow creased with concern that slowly deepened into confusion and then disbelief. Still, Dana didn't dismiss it outright. She wrapped Lila in a blanket from the van, called off the rest of the tour, and drove straight to the Riverview Sheriff's Department. Lila, still shaking, recounted the events to a deputy who looked vaguely amused. "Voices? Underground chapel? Sounds like she's got quite an imagination," he murmured to Dana as he handed Lila a hot chocolate. "Probably wandered into an old drainage tunnel. They used to run all kinds of pipes through that property, back in the 40s. And she brought these—" She held up the photo and the veil. The deputy glanced at them, then shrugged. "Could be anything. Costume piece, old souvenir photo. Look, we can send someone to check the site tomorrow when the rain clears, but there's not much we can do tonight." Lila protested, insisting the door was real, that someone had whispered her name, but the more she talked, the more her voice cracked with desperation, the more the officers exchanged knowing glances. They were humoring her. Dana watched, something twisting deep in her stomach. The photo Lila had found, it gnawed at her. She had seen that image before, or one like it. Years ago, back when she was still working as a junior reporter for the Riverview Gazette. She'd covered the disappearance of the two nuns, her first real assignment. She had interviewed parishioners, dug through public records, even followed a dead-end lead that took her to an abandoned winery 2 counties over. Nothing had ever panned out, and eventually the paper dropped the story. But there had been photos. One in particular had always haunted her, a black-and-white print of Sister Mary and Sister Judith taken outside the chapel a few days before they vanished. The photo in her daughter's hand was the same scene, but the angle was different. It hadn't been the one released to the press. She was sure of it. Only one version had ever been published. This had to be an original from the same set, perhaps even from the missing roll the church archivist had claimed was lost in a filing error. Her breath caught as she looked closer. In the background of the photo, barely visible behind the two seated women, was the outline of a structure she hadn't noticed before. A stone cross, partially obscured by trees. But St. Madeline's hadn't had an exterior crucifix in that spot since the 1970s. It had been removed during renovations and never reinstalled. Which meant this photo, this version, was taken before the chapel was altered, before the basement was sealed, before whatever happened to the sisters occurred. Dana excused herself from the station, claiming she was taking Lila home to rest, but instead of heading straight there, she detoured to her attic. Boxes labeled Gazette Archives 2009 lined the far wall. She dug through them feverishly, hands trembling. Inside a dusty file marked St. Madeline Disappearance, she found her old notes, her annotated copies of the police reports, and a faded folder containing interview transcripts. She flipped through the documents, scanning for one in particular, a name, Emily Nolan, the child who'd handed in the drawing of The Thing in the Dark Room. She found her old Felta finding the well-petissiment of the girl's account. Now, looking at Lila's description, the door, the humming, the photo, she saw eerie similarities. She reread the old transcript. Emily had drawn a black cross on a door. She'd described the room as smelling like metal and dirt. She said the sisters were under the church and that something watches from the walls. No one had believed her, and now, 14 years later, Lila, her own daughter, had fallen into what might be the same place and emerged with physical evidence. Dana's hands shook as she picked up the veil, running her fingers over the embroidery. The thread was delicate, hand-stitched. It matched exactly with archived photos of the sisters' garments. This was no costume. She looked back at Lila, curled on the couch, now wrapped in dry clothes but still visibly shaken. "Sweetheart," Dana whispered, kneeling beside her. "That photo you found. Did you see anyone else? Anyone alive?" Lila hesitated, her voice small. "I heard someone." She was humming, and she knew my name. Dana's pulse raced. She needed to go back. Not alone, not recklessly. But someone had to see that tunnel again. Because if she was right, then something had survived down there. Something the town had buried, literally, and tried to forget. The moon over Riverview that night was hidden behind thick veils of cloud, turning the world beneath it into a landscape of silhouettes and shadow. Dana parked her car a quarter-mile from the chapel, far enough that her headlights wouldn't catch the attention of any wandering patrol. She wasn't supposed to be there, of course, not at that hour, not without permission, but waiting for bureaucracy to believe what she already knew in her gut felt like betrayal. Of her daughter, of the sisters, of the truth. She left the engine off and pulled on a dark waterproof jacket, the kind she hadn't worn since her reporting days, and strapped a compact infrared wildlife camera to her belt. It wasn't high-end, but it had motion detection, night vision, and could be monitored from her phone. It would have to do. She slipped through the brush behind the chapel, her footsteps muffled by damp leaves and the soft squish of earth. The air was cold, still tinged with the leftover dampness from that afternoon's rain. The old gate that Lila had used was bent enough for her to crawl under. As she approached the area her daughter had described, she spotted the disturbed earth, a ragged tear in the ground partially hidden by roots and mud. She knelt and aimed her flashlight into the darkness below. The tunnel was there, real, exactly where Lila said. She swallowed her fear and mounted the infrared camera to a gnarled tree branch just above the opening, pointing it downward. She activated the motion sensor, enabled remote viewing, then sat back on her heels, heart thumping. The place was as quiet as death, but then, with the light from her phone, she noticed something that made her breath catch. Just above the tunnel entrance, on a chunk of exposed wall that had crumbled with the erosion, was a painting, faded but unmistakable. The face of the Virgin Mary, rendered in sorrow hues, her eyes cast downward, hands clasped in sorrow. Someone had painted it directly onto the old stone. Not spray paint, not graffiti. This was deliberate, sacred. But there was something wrong. The paint near her hands was darker, stained. Dana leaned in closer. Her flashlight beam picked up streaks of brownish red running downward from the edge of the robe. Dried blood. Long dried, but real. She touched the stone and felt her stomach turn. The stain hadn't been painted. It had seeped. From what? From whom? She stood abruptly, wiped her hand against her jeans, and backed away. Every instinct screamed for her to leave, to come back with police, but she had to be sure. She opened the remote view on her phone and watched the live feed from the infrared camera. The tunnel mouth looked like a black void, unmoving. She adjusted the sensitivity and set the motion alert to high. Then she stepped back and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Her phone buzzed, movement detected. She clicked the notification. The feed showed something shifting in the darkness, just past the camera's range. Something quick and low, not an animal. Not the slow shuffle of someone old or injured. It moved with purpose. She increased the contrast. A figure emerged briefly, backlit by the faintest residual heat, slender, human-shaped, with what looked like a cloth draped over its shoulders. The figure stopped at the edge of the frame, turned its head as if looking directly at the lens, then disappeared again into shadow. Dana froze. The footage was clear. Whoever it was, they were alive. Not a ghost, not a myth. Someone was living down there. She tapped her screen to save the recording and marked the timestamp. Her thoughts spiraled. If this person had survived 14 years underground, how? What had they eaten? Who helped them? Unless no one had helped. Unless someone had kept them there. Her heart raced faster as she remembered Lila's words. She was humming. She knew my name. Dana knew she needed help. This was bigger than a story, bigger than her instincts. She turned to leave, then hesitated and glanced back at the image of the Virgin Mary, her painted eyes weeping in visible blood under the moonless sky. Dana whispered, "I'm coming back, I promise." And just as she stepped beyond the brush line, her phone buzzed again. Dana barely slept that night. She kept replaying the infrared footage over and over, watching the brief glimpse of the figure in the tunnel pause at the edge of the frame as if it knew it was being watched. Every movement, every second of stillness haunted her. By dawn, her inbox had exploded. Somehow, the footage had been leaked, possibly by someone at the station whom she had shown out of desperation, and now her old editor from the Riverview Gazette was texting nonstop. "Need to publish this," he wrote. "It's the story of the decade." But Dana ignored it all. This wasn't just a story. It was a wound reopening after years of being quietly stitched shut. Around noon, as she pored over her old notebooks, looking for connections she might have missed, the doorbell rang. At her porch sat a small, unmarked envelope. No postage, no return address, just her name, D. Bennett, written in tight, slanted cursive. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper, folded once. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate. It read, "I know who built the tunnel, but I will not speak openly. If you wish to understand, come to St. Agnes Rest Home. Ask for Sister Lenora. Show her the veil." She will know. Dana stared at the words, stunned. This wasn't someone fishing for attention. This was someone who knew things. The note had been delivered in person, likely by someone elderly or discreet enough not to draw suspicion. She glanced at the veil still resting atop her folder of evidence. Could this be real? Could someone else remember what the town had tried so hard to forget? St. Agnes Rest Home was an hour's drive east, a modest care facility run by the church, mostly housing retired clergy and nuns. Dana arrived by early evening, her heart pounding with anticipation and dread. At the reception desk, she asked, "Is Sister Lenora available?" The attendant hesitated, glanced at a clipboard. "She doesn't usually take visitors." Dana reached into her bag and pulled out the veil. "Tell her I have this." 10 minutes later, Dana was escorted down a long, hushed hallway to a private room filled with the scent of lavender and old paper. The woman sitting by the window was small, hunched, her white habit slightly yellowed with age. Her eyes were pale blue, milky but alert. "You're the one," Sister Lenora said before Dana could speak, "the daughter of the journalist, the girl who returned from the earth?" Dana sat across from her, stunned. "How did you—" "The veil," the old nun interrupted gently. "It's hers. I stitched the hem myself in 2008. Dana placed it carefully into the nun's hands. Lenora cradled it like a relic. "Tell me," Dana whispered, "who built the tunnel?" The silence in the room deepened. Then Sister Lenora said, "It wasn't part of the original chapel, that much is true. But it wasn't built for evil, not at first." She explained that in the early 1970s, the church had quietly funded underground shelters beneath several rural chapels, remnants of Cold War paranoia. Some were designed as bomb shelters, others as archival vaults. But someone repurposed it, she said. Someone with influence. Dana leaned forward. Who? Sister Lenora looked away, her lips trembling. He was a priest then, young, charismatic. Everyone trusted him. Father Mallory. Dana flipped through her mental archives. She had never heard the name in any public file related to the chapel. He was transferred, wasn't he? Lenora nodded. In 1981, suddenly. No explanation? The Vatican sent him away after an incident. She reached into her drawer and pulled out a worn envelope, handing it to Dana. Inside were clippings, news articles about a Father Benedict Mallory reassigned from Riverview to a monastery in Wyoming. No details, no scandal, just a silent squampling, the kind the church did when it didn't want to raise questions. Dana read faster, her pulse quickening. One article mentioned that after a nervous breakdown, Mallory was moved again, this time to a retirement home under a different name. He's still alive? Dana asked. He was, Lenora replied. If you want answers, go to Mercy Pines in Barton County. He was placed there under the name Benjamin Marsh. Dana left that night with the veil, the envelope, and a sick feeling in her chest. The pieces were aligning too well. The hasty transfer, the buried tunnel, the whispers in the dark, the blood. She drove through the night, her headlights slicing through fog that seemed to rise from the road itself. At 2:30 a.m. she arrived at Mercy Pines, a quiet, dimly lit building nestled behind rows of pine trees. She gave the receptionist the name Benjamin Marsh, claiming to be a niece. The young man checked the logs and nodded. He doesn't get visitors. Room 203. She ascended the creaking staircase, the hallway silent save for the distant hum of machines and the occasional cough. Room 203 was dim, lit only by a nightlight. Inside, an old man lay in bed, eyes half closed, face gaunt but strangely familiar. As she stepped closer, his eyelids fluttered. "Sister Judith?" he murmured. Dana froze. His eyes snapped open and locked onto hers. Dana stood frozen in the doorway as the frail man on the hospital bed repeated the name again, barely a whisper. "Sister Judith?" His eyes were sunken yet sharp, pupils darting beneath lids wrinkled like brittle parchment. "No," Dana said softly, stepping closer. "I'm not her. My name is Dana Bennett. I need to talk to you about the chapel." The man blinked rapidly, disoriented, then turned his head away toward the darkened window, as if chasing shadows long buried. "It's not real," he mumbled. "Not anymore. They bricked it. They said it never existed." Dana pulled the veil from her coat and laid it gently across his chest. "But it did, and you know that." The old man's fingers trembled as they touched the cloth, his breath catching with a dry rasp. "Still smells like her," he whispered, "lavender and candle wax." "Were you Father Benedict Mallory?" He didn't answer immediately, but his eyes narrowed, and after a long silence he said, "I was once. Now I am just the remnant." She leaned in. "You were stationed at St. Madeline's during the late 70s. You knew about the tunnel?" His body stiffened. "It was supposed to be holy," he said. "A refuge. During the war, World War II, they built them under select chapels. Not for bombs, not for people. For scrolls. Relics. Vatican documents too sensitive for Europe. We were told it was sacred preservation, a secret between the church and the old families who funded the construction." Dana's heart pounded. She knew whispers of secret Vatican archives had long fascinated conspiracy theorists, but this was different. "And then," she prompted. He closed his eyes. "It changed. The church forgot, or pretended to forget. The tunnels became empty, hollow places beneath holy ground. By the time I arrived in 74, it was already being—" He called himself caretaker at first, Mallory continued, voice low and haunted. "Said he was assigned by the diocese to maintain the chapel's foundation. I believed him. We all did. He was persuasive, kind at first. Helped restore stained glass, painted the altar with his own hands. But he stayed late, slept in the sacristy, and he asked too many questions about who came and went, why they let him stay." Dana's voice shook. "What did he do?" The old man swallowed hard. "He used the tunnel to lock people away. At first we thought he was just odd, obsessed with confession. He'd take in runaways, drug users, pregnant girls from the city, said he was giving them sanctuary, but then he wouldn't let them leave. He said the world would pollute them again. That silence was purity. Dana clutched the edge of the blanket. You knew this was happening? Mallory shook his head slowly. Not at first. He covered it well. But in 2009, Sister Mary and Sister Judith discovered it. They were doing inventory of the chapel's archives when they found one of the trap doors left ajar. They followed it, saw what he had built, and they came to me. His voice cracked then, and his hands gripped the edge of the bed. They wanted to go to the archdiocese, to expose him, but before they could, they vanished. Dana's mouth went dry. You think he took them? Mallory didn't answer. Instead, he reached into the drawer of his nightstand with a shaking hand and pulled out an envelope sealed with brittle wax. This is my confession, he said. I wrote it in 2011. Never sent it. Too afraid, too ashamed. I let them silence me. They told me it was best to forget, that the church had no interest in ghosts. Dana took the envelope, hands trembling, and slid it into her coat. Who was he? She asked one more time. Who was the man you called caretaker? Mallory's eyes turned glassy. He had many names, but the one that matters now. His lips formed the word before he said it aloud, barely audible. Redwood? Dana's body went cold. Silas Redwood, the man who owns the property now? Mallory nodded once, weakly. He bought it in '82, said he wanted to protect the legacy, but he was just building walls no one could see through. Dana rose, her mind reeling. He still lives there. My daughter, she found the entrance again. She heard someone. We saw someone on camera. He's still hiding their action. Mallory's voice dropped to a whisper. Then you have to be the one to open the walls. Dana left Mercy Pines at dawn, her hands still gripping the steering wheel hours after she'd pulled into her driveway. The name Redwood echoed in her mind like a tolling bell, ominous and inevitable. She didn't sleep. Instead, she emailed the recording of Mallory's confession to Deputy Hawkins, along with the veil, the photos, the journaled evidence, and the infrared footage. By 10 a.m., the Sheriff's Department had issued a quiet warrant to re-enter the property, this time with a forensic team, a structural engineer, and a state representative from the Missing Persons Unit. Dana was allowed to observe, but not interfere. She agreed, barely able to stay in the designated zone near the tree line. She watched as the deputies, now fully armed and equipped with portable air monitors, approached the tunnel entrance. A portable fan was already dispersing fresh air into the shaft. The team confirmed the vent system was still active, likely powered remotely or through a hidden generator. It wasn't ancient, it had been maintained, which meant someone was still using the system. The officers descended with methodical precision, radios opened, every movement logged. Inside, they found what Lila had described: stone walls, etched scriptures, makeshift furniture. But the deeper they moved, the stranger it became. Someone had patched the brickwork in several places with modern mortar. There were footprints, small and fresh, scraps of plastic food packaging that hadn't been made before 2020. Someone had been down there recently. They reached the chamber with the iron door, the one with claw marks and the humming Dana had heard through her daughter's story. This time the door opened. Behind it was a narrow passage choked with damp air and the smell of stale candles. A crucifix lay on the floor, its wood splintered. Then came the voice, faint, distant, a woman humming. The team followed the sound through the twisting corridor, which finally opened into a chamber that had clearly once served as a prayer room. A small mattress sat in the corner, a stool next to it, and above the mattress, scrawled in ash and soot on the wall, was the phrase, "Blessed are the silent." Sitting on the mattress was a woman, ashen pale. Her hair was cropped short and matted to her scalp, her eyes wide and unblinking as she stared at the flashlight beams. She wore a nun's habit, too large for her frame, hanging from her shoulders like draped cloth on a forgotten statue. The deputies froze. One of them stepped forward. "Ma'am, we're here to help. Can you tell us your name?" She looked at him blankly, her head tilting slightly, as if trying to understand the language he spoke. Then she whispered, "She said not to leave. She said it's dangerous outside." The deputy crouched. "Who said that?" Her lips barely moved. "Sister Judith," she said, "the air isn't clean, that God watches down here, not up there." They asked again for her name, but she only shook her head slowly, as if the concept no longer applied. She didn't ask who they were. She didn't ask what year it was. She didn't even blink when the medic touched her wrist to take a pulse. When they helped her stand, she swayed like a branch too long kept in darkness. As they led her out, she stopped once, pointed to the corridor behind her, and whispered, "Don't wake the other one." Then she collapsed. Outside, Dana watched in stunned silence as the woman was lifted into the daylight, arms covering her face instinctively. She looked no older than 50, but her body was so frail it was impossible to guess her true age. A nurse confirmed her vitals were stable but abnormal, her blood pressure low, her hydration levels bordering on critical, but she was alive. She had survived. 14 years underground, Dana stepped forward, keeping her promise to stay silent, but unable to stop the tears that welled in her eyes. When the woman passed by her on the stretcher, their eyes met briefly, and Dana saw something behind the haze, a flicker of memory, of awareness. "Do you know her?" she asked one of the nurses. The nurse shook her head. "No idea, doesn't respond to most names, but she keeps repeating the word chapel." The detectives ordered a secondary sweep. If there was one survivor, there might be more, or worse, remains. As the team re-entered, Dana watched her phone, which was synced to a secondary thermal feed the officers had set up deeper inside the tunnel. Movement registered again, far beyond where the woman had been found. A second chamber. A flicker of heat. It wasn't consistent, like a human body, but it was there. Something was still moving. The hospital lights buzzed softly above the bed, where the woman in the tattered habit now lay, her breathing steadier under the mask, her body slowly rehydrating through the IV. Dana sat nearby, unable to leave even as the doctors worked around her. The woman hadn't spoken since arriving. She'd remained in a kind of trance, flinching at every light, every beeping machine. Yet Dana saw something shifting behind her gaze, like memories pressing against glass, waiting to be let out. The medical team drew blood and sent it for a rapid DNA test, cross-referencing it against public genealogy databases and the archived files from the 2009 investigation. 3 days later, the results came back, a 99.8% match. The woman was Sister Mary Eloise, the nun declared dead whose funeral mass had been held in her absence, whose name still appeared carved in the memorial plaque outside the chapel ruins. 5. Forgotten, hidden in plain earth. The revelation swept through the community like wildfire. News outlets camped outside the hospital. The diocese released a carefully worded statement expressing shock and deep sadness, pledging cooperation with the investigation. Dana wasn't surprised when the church's internal spokesperson avoided direct references to Redwood or the tunnel's origins. But law enforcement was under no such restriction. Investigators reopened all files linked to St. Madeleine's disappearance. Leads that had once gone cold suddenly reignited. One name, buried deep in the original personnel logs, stood out: Father Gerald Lornette. He had been the supervising monastic head for that region in the early 2000s. Transferred out abruptly in 2010 after what internal documents labeled as philosophical divergency and issues of procedural discipline. In other words, something went very wrong. Further digging revealed that Lauren had been moved to a monastic health facility in Oregon, St. Marcus of the Fields, under church supervision. It took a subpoena, but the state secured access. He was there, still alive, but suffering from late-stage Alzheimer's. According to staff, he barely recognized his own name most days. However, when the name Sister Mary Eloise was mentioned, during a cautious interview, he muttered a single word: "Forgive me." Dana flew to Oregon with Deputy Hawkins and a federal liaison. They met with Lauren's appointed guardian, who gave them a box of personal effects recovered from his old quarters before his memory had declined. Inside were journals, dozens, small leather-bound volumes packed with meticulous handwriting. The most recent one, dated 2010, just a cross etched into the cover. Dana opened it with gloved hands and began reading. The entries started cryptically, as if Gerald had already begun losing his grip on linear time. He mentioned "the girls in the walls" and "confessions whispered through stone," and then, clear as a bell on the 5th page, "Sister Mary sees too much. She and Judith wanted to tell. Redwood said it must be silence or chaos. I prayed. I did nothing." The following pages painted a picture of complicity wrapped in religious justification. Father Lorne had known, who had learned early on that Redwood, who presented himself as a devoted benefactor, was holding people underground. He had rationalized it at first, believing the women were unstable or in need of spiritual isolation. But over time, as he saw fewer answers and more locks, his doubts grew. And yet he still did nothing. In one particularly harrowing entry, Lorne described the moment Sister Judith confronted him, telling him they would go directly to the Archbishop with what they had found. She never got the chance. Redwood said they had tried to flee, that the forest was cruel, that wolves take those who wander. But there were no wolves. There was only his silence and mine. Dana closed the journal, her chest heavy with fury and disbelief. They had known. The Church had known. And instead of investigating, they had moved people around like chess pieces, rewriting the story to protect a facade. Back in Riverview, forensic teams had excavated the second chamber. There, beneath crumbling stone and behind a false wall, they found what was left of Sister Judith Keller. A frail skeleton curled beside a worn rosary and a letter never sent, half-finished, water-damaged. She had survived nearly 3 years, according to Sister Mary's phlegmatic memories, and then nothing. No ceremony, no burial, just silence. Dana attended to quiet mass held for Judith that week, standing beside Sister Mary's hospital wheelchair, her hand resting gently on the older woman's. Sister Mary didn't cry. She just whispered one sentence as the incense drifted through the chapel. She told me not to give up, so I waited. Meanwhile, Redwood had disappeared. No charges yet filed, no known address. But someone had helped him, Dana was sure. He couldn't have operated alone. And now, Sister Mary had begun whispering about a second door. The final entries in Gerald Lorne's journal were more fragmented, laced with delusions and scripture woven into confessions. Dana read them slowly, line by line, while seated beside Sister Mary in the quiet wing of the hospital, where the air was always too cold and the silence too respectful. The most disturbing section came near the end, dated just months before his relocation. It began with a quote from Leviticus, then spiraled into a personal manifesto. "She is chosen," he wrote. "She is the vessel through which the rot shall be absorbed. As Christ bore the sins of man, so too shall she bear the sins of the Church. Not in death, but in confinement. This is her anointing. This is justice rendered by obedience." Dana's hands trembled as she turned the page, her stomach tightening. Lorne hadn't just been complicit. He had turned Sister Mary into a scapegoat, a human symbol to carry the weight of everything the Church feared revealing. His theology was twisted, apocalyptic in tone, invoking purging fire and sacred silence. "Redwood was the hammer, but I was the altar," he wrote, "and she the sacrifice." Dana closed the journal, her throat burning. This wasn't a cover-up born from cowardice. It was ritualized, sanctified in their minds. What was done to Sister Mary wasn't just criminal, it was a perversion of belief, wrapped in sanctimony. Later that day, authorities returned to the tunnels for one final sweep, determined to ensure nothing remained hidden. It was Sister Mary herself, now coherent in fragments, who mentioned the other room, the one beyond the second passage, where no one was allowed but Redwood and Lorne. Her voice cracked when she described it. "He called it the witness wall, said it was proof of God's mercy. I think it was where he prayed." The team followed her memory through the narrow tunnel, this time equipped with ground-penetrating radar. Behind a section of collapsed brick, they found a sealed chamber barely 8 feet wide. When they cleared the debris, a thin shaft of light from a broken ventilation duct cast eerie shadows on the far wall. And there, covering every inch of stone, were photographs. Hundreds, some black and white, some Polaroid, some printed on faded Kodak paper. The faces of children stared out from the wall, children of all ages, ethnicities, and expressions. Each photo bore a name, a date, and a number. On closer inspection, investigators realized many of the names matched those from a now-defunct orphan support program run by Sister Madeline's during the late 90s. Sister Mary and Sister Judith had once overseen it, devoting themselves to placing abandoned or neglected children into safe foster homes. These were their children. Their legacy. Dana pressed her fingers to her lips, overwhelmed. Some of the photos had handwritten notes on the back, placed with the Norrises, 2003. Graduated valedictorian, 2010. Now teaches music in San Jose. The wall wasn't a trophy case. It was memory preserved. Somehow, even in the darkness, Redwood or Lorne, or both, had kept this as a twisted shrine to what had once been good. A record not of sin, but of stolen light. Perhaps, Dana thought, that was the deepest cruelty of all. Sister Mary's captivity wasn't just punishment for discovery. It was tethering her to a past they refused to let go. They had entombed her beside the only things that had made her life meaningful. When investigators cleared the last photo, they found a small cross embedded into the wall behind it, carved with deliberate precision. Beneath it were two words, etched in Latin, Vera Expiatio. True attendant. The media erupted when the discovery was made public. Survivors of the orphan program came forward, now grown, and many still remembered Sister Mary's kindness. Some wept on camera. One young woman said, "She saved my life. I thought she was dead. All this time I prayed for her." The church scrambled to respond, issuing apologies, launching inquiries, and promising accountability, though most knew little would change beyond surface gestures. But for Sister Mary, it wasn't about justice anymore. She spoke rarely, but clearly now. Her body was healing, but her spirit was something else entirely. Weathered, yes, but not broken. When Dana visited her in the hospital garden one morning, Sister Mary was staring at the sky. "I saw birds today," she said quietly. "I forgot they moved together like that." Dana sat beside her. "You were their light. All those children, you gave them something real." Sister Mary nodded slowly. "Then it was worth it, even the dark. If one child found joy, it was worth the waiting." "You were never forgotten," Dana whispered. "Not by all of us." The trial against church officials proceeded slowly. Redwood was eventually located in Nevada, hiding under a false name. His arrest made headlines for weeks. He denied everything, of course, but the evidence buried him hot as stroke before sentencing. Gerald Lorne passed away quietly in his sleep, never lucid again. His journal became part of the official church archives, a chilling record of corrupted faith. But St. Madeline's did not remain silent. On the one-year anniversary of Sister Mary's rescue, the town gathered at the newly built memorial chapel constructed atop the ruins. Its cornerstone read, "For those kept in darkness, may their light never be buried again." Sister Mary stood at the entrance that day, holding Lila's hand, and when the choir sang, she hummed along. Her voice was thin but steady, and for the first time in a long time, the sound did not echo against stone. It rose freely into the open air. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more true mystery-inspired narratives. What part of Sister Mary's journey struck you the most? And where are you watching from? Drop a comment. I'd love to know your thoughts.